Discipline was vital with so many men in such a confined space. On every ship kept in a red bag was the infamous cat o' nine tails. A lash of the rope was the brutal answer to every infringement of the ship's strict rules.
Pirates weren't just treasure hunters, they were also sadistic, merciless, and incredibly violent lots. They didn't just raid ships. Their punishments for offenders were ruthless in the most barbaric ways imaginable, from feeding captives their own body parts to horrifying public displays and executions. They devised some of the most diabolical punishments just to maintain command of their vessels. What were some of these heinous practices? Join us as we reveal some of history's most brutal pirate punishments. Marooning. For pirates who broke the code in unforgivable ways, like stealing treasure or abandoning their mates, the punishment was brutal: marooning. This meant being abandoned on a deserted island with no food, no fresh water, and little hope of survival. The condemned would usually get a bottle of rum, a pistol, and some gunpowder to slowly pass away or end things on their terms. This practice dates back to the 1700s, with its name possibly rooted in the Spanish word chimarrón, which referred to runaway slaves or wild animals. In pirate slang, to be marooned was sarcastically called being made governor of an island. This punishment was almost always fatal, though a few managed to survive. One of the most famous cases was in 1720, when pirate Captain Edward England and his crew were left stranded on a barren island in the Indian Ocean. Defying the odds, they survived for 4 months by building a boat and sailing to Madagascar. Another survivor was Robert Jeffrey, a sailor marooned by the British Navy in 1807. He was rescued by an American ship, and the officer who abandoned him was dismissed from the Navy. However, the most famous marooning tale is that of Alexander Selkirk, a sailor abandoned on a remote island off Chile after arguing with his captain. Selkirk lived alone for 4 years before being rescued. Enduring weeks of isolation on a deserted island might seem like mercy compared to the next horror that awaits any unsubordinated soul who dares break the rules aboard the ship. Whipping with the cat o' nine tails. The cat o' nine tails, often simply called the cat, was a brutal whip with 9 knotted cords at the end.
Is this a typical cat o' nine tails? And is this...
It is. There's a couple of other types. You could have a wooden handle or a rope handle.
Sometimes the cords had fish hooks or musket balls attached to them to inflict even more pain. The whip would be stored in a sack, and when someone was to be flogged, it would be taken out, which led to the expression to let the cat out of the bag. For pirates such as John Phillips, captain of the Revenge, breaking the rules could lead to severe punishment, usually 39 lashes, a number known as Moses' Law, believed to be the limit a person could survive. Some endured more, but many perished from far fewer. The cat often still bore the blood and guts from the last punishment, making it more likely that wounds would turn gangrenous and lead to the victim perishing. The cat o' nine tails was more than just a tool of punishment. It was a symbol of fear and control, striking terror into the hearts of both sailors and pirates. Naval historian Inam Roger described it as the voice of naval discipline, a language every seaman understood. Each cord of the cat o' nine tails was about 2 feet long and made from thin rope or rawhide. The name cat o' nine tails could refer to the 9 lives of a cat or to the scratch-like wounds it inflicted. First appearing in print in 1681, it had been used long before that during the Age of Sail, from the 16th to the 19th centuries. In the British Royal Navy, flogging was officially sanctioned in 1661 with the Articles of War, which allowed captains to order floggings for offences ranging from minor infractions like drunkenness to more serious crimes like theft or mutiny. The number of lashes administered could vary greatly depending on the offence and the captain's discretion. Commodore James Barron, for instance, ordered 500 lashes for a sailor named Robert Jeffrey in 1812, which he survived, though many did not. Infections and shock from blood loss were common.
In one particular prison run by a governor who was known for his cruelty, it even meant 100 lashes from the cat-o'-nine-tails whip.
And passing away was not unusual. In 1731, a sailor named John Ball received 500 lashes for desertion, but passed away 3 days later from his wounds. The psychological impact of flogging was as severe as its physical toll. Admiral John Jarvis, Earl of St. Vincent, once noted that discipline is preserved in a ship by the dread of punishment. This fear was evident whenever a flogging was ordered. The crew was summoned to watch the cat, gathering to witness the punishment, which was often carried out in silence. The victim was tied to a mast or a grating, with the ship's surgeon standing by, though often as a formality rather than intervention. The use of brine to clean the wounds was standard practice, adding another layer of agony to the already excruciating experience. Jack Nastiface, a sailor who experienced flogging, wrote in his memoirs about the brutal aftermath. When cut down, he was taken to the sick bay, where the doctor dressed his wounds with pickles. Many days elapsed before he could perform his duty, and weeks before his shirt could bear to touch his back. Despite the brutality, not all captains favored flogging. Captain William Blee, known for his restraint following the mutiny on the Bounty, punished disobedience with 12 lashes. Similarly, Captain James Cook, during his 1770s voyages, preferred alternatives like confinement or reduced rations over flogging. Public opinion started turning against flogging in the 19th century, with Charles Dickens and Herman Melville among those who criticized the practice in their works. In the United States, flogging was limited to 12 lashes in 1850 and officially abolished in 1862. The British Royal Navy followed suit in 1879, though they still retained it as a punishment for mutiny until 1881. For some pirate captains, simply whipping disobedient crew members wasn't enough. They devised some of the most diabolical and inhuman methods to send their message across. Torture. While most pirates focused on treasure, some captains took cruelty to new extremes, using brutal tactics to break the will of their captives. They believed that spreading fear through violence would make future victims surrender without resistance. These so-called pirate persuasions ranged from savage beatings and whippings to grotesque methods like tying a cord around a victim's head and tightening it until their eyes bulged. One favored method involved dunking prisoners into the sea from a ship's yardarm repeatedly until they confessed or begged for mercy. Some stories of pirate cruelty are shocking even by the standards of the time. One Portuguese captain who tossed his purse overboard had his lips sliced off and burned before his eyes. English pirate Charles Vane, infamous for his brutality, tortured captives with burning matches and left sailors battered, bloodied, or worse. Henry Every, another English pirate, captured the Mughal treasure ship Ganges Sawai in 1695. His crew subjected passengers to unimaginable horrors, assaulting them for gold before taking their lives and throwing them overboard. Similarly, Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts, despite his success as a pirate, was notorious for senseless cruelty. In one instance, he mutilated Dutch sailors, hanged others, and used their corpses for target practice. Among the most vicious was Edward Ned Lowe, whose name became synonymous with terror. In 1722, Lowe took the lives of Portuguese passengers, burned ships to the waterline, and forced prisoners to endure grotesque punishments. One was made to eat his ears, another his own heart. Off Brazil, another cruel pirate, Edmund Condent, was said to have boiled and eaten the heart of a captive who had dared to resist. Whenever this form of punishment was mentioned for both crew members or captured seafarers, what usually came to mind was the physical torment they had to endure. But for the next kind of punishment, the pirate played psychological games with their victims. Walking the plank. One of the most infamous practices in pirate history.
You didn't wash the dishes. We sentence you to walking the plank.
Was making a captive walk the plank. This gruesome form of punishment involved a prisoner, hands bound with ropes and threatened at sword point, inching their way along a wooden plank balanced over the side of a ship. Danish pirate John Drake and the notorious New York river pirate Sadie the Goat were among those said to have used the plank as a tool of terror. But more commonly, pirates simply tossed offending crew members overboard without the dramatic ceremony. The origins of this cruel spectacle have been lost in time, but accounts of it stretch back to the golden age of piracy in the 7th and 18th centuries. The term walking the plank didn't appear in print until the early 19th century, with one of the earliest mentions found in Francis Gross's 1796 Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue. One of the earliest recorded instances occurred in 1663 when Dutch sailor Jan Erasmus Reyning witnessed the pirate captain François l'Olonnais forcing several Spanish prisoners to walk the plank off the coast of Venezuela. L'Olonnais, infamous for his sadistic tendencies, laughed as he watched them plunge into the shark-infested waters below. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, was another pirate who used the plank as both punishment and a public spectacle. In 1720, off the coast of Newfoundland, Roberts captured the slave ship Samuel and made the crew walk the plank. William Snellgrave, the ship's captain, later described the event as a most horrid spectacle that haunted him for years. Roberts's pirate code of conduct included democratic elements like every man has a vote in affairs of moment, but also strict penalties for desertion or theft, punishable by marooning or by taking the culprit's like. In 1769, the crew of the British merchant ship Betsy staged their version of the plank by making the captain and 2 officers walk it rather than taking their lives outright. Remarkably, they survived by clinging to floating debris and were eventually rescued, a rare escape from a grim fate. The plank wasn't confined to the Caribbean and the Atlantic. In the South China Sea, the notorious pirate Qing Yi Sao, also known as Qing Shi, used the plank against rivals and uncooperative crew members. Operating in the early 19th century, Qing Shi commanded a fleet of over 300 ships and 20,000 to 40,000 pirates. Her strict code of conduct included punishments for assault on women and theft, but also allowed for extreme measures against enemies, maintaining her fearsome reputation. The last documented instance of walking the plank occurred in 1822, when the Spanish pirate Benito de Soto forced passengers and crew of the Morning Star to walk the plank off the coast of Ascension Island. This marked the end of an era, as the golden age of piracy was fading and naval powers were becoming more effective at quashing pirate activity. While walking the plank was subsequently abolished, ship captains devised even more terrifying methods of punishment. Methods like the next one on our list. Keel hauling. This was one of the most dreaded punishments at sea, a brutal ordeal where a sailor would be tied at the feet and dragged underneath the ship's keel from one side to the other, often left a bloody mess with shredded clothes and skin. The sharp barnacles on the ship's hull made survival unlikely, and drowning was a frequent fate. This punishment, which originated in the Dutch Navy in the 17th century, was as much about instilling fear as it was about discipline. The term keel hauling comes from the Dutch word kallen, meaning to haul under the keel. It wasn't just pirates who used this method. The Dutch, who were known for their naval might during the Golden Age, employed it to maintain strict order among their crew. One of the earliest instances was in 1622, when a Dutch sailor named Pilgrim Willem faced this grim fate for striking his captain. The process was merciless. The condemned sailor would be stripped and tied with ropes, sometimes with weights attached to help them sink beneath the ship. Crew members would haul the unfortunate across the keel, dragging them through the barnacle-covered water beneath. This punishment was as brutal as it was humiliating, often resulting in severe lacerations, broken bones, or even drowning. While the Dutch Navy was notorious for using keel hauling, other European navies, like the Russians and the British, occasionally resorted to it. Tsar Peter the Great in the 18th century even witnessed a keel hauling and endorsed it as an effective means of discipline. The French, however, found it too barbaric, and the British generally condemned it as un-English, even though unofficial instances were reported. Pirates, contrary to popular belief, didn't frequently use keel hauling. They preferred quicker, simpler punishments like marooning or walking the plank. But the threat of keel hauling was enough to maintain order aboard their ships. The practice faced criticism even in the 18th century. Montesquieu, the French philosopher, argued against it in his The Spirit of the Laws, stating, "Keel hauling ought to be prescribed in all nations because it is contrary to humanity." Despite such opposition, it persisted in some navies into the 19th century. The last official instance occurred in 1853 in the Dutch Navy, sparking public outrage and eventually leading to its abolition. Still on how pirates were kept in check by the government, the next form of punishment wasn't just a caution to the pirates, it bore a terrifying image in the minds of anyone who might have cared for them. Hanging. The most common punishment for captured pirates towards the end of the Golden Age was hanging, typically performed right after a trial. These public executions were meant to serve as a clear warning to others, displayed in locations where mariners could easily see the consequences of piracy. In London, pirates faced their fate at a place called Execution Dock in Wapping, right along the River Thames. Here, several pirates would be hanged together, especially during times of increased anti-piracy campaigns when whole crews were condemned together. The condemned men were escorted from Newgate or Marshalsea prisons, led by an officer carrying a silver oar, symbolizing the authority of the High Court of the Admiralty. The execution dock was a significant spot.
Gibbet is a cage, as you can see, roughly human shape.
The location near the sea reminded everyone that these crimes were committed by mariners, and the low tide point indicated that it was the Admiralty's jurisdiction. The condemned stood on a simple wooden gallows as a chaplain spoke and offered a prayer. They were then allowed their last words, which were often recorded and shared with the public. The pirate would then be pushed off the ladder, typically dying from strangulation rather than a broken neck. Afterward, the body would be taken down and either staked out on the beach or tied to a wooden post, left to be exposed for 3 tides before being buried in an unmarked grave. For particularly notorious pirates, usually the captains, their bodies were left to rot in an iron cage. The Scottish privateer turned pirate Captain Kidd was a prime example. Found guilty of piracy and taking the life of others in 1701, Kidd was hanged in London, his body tarred and then placed in a cage by the River Thames, where it remained visible to passing ships for 2 years. This form of punishment was still being carried out 20 years later. John Rackham, also known as Calico Jack, met the same fate in Jamaica in 1720. His body was hung in a cage on Dead Man's Cay in Port Royal as a deterrent. Charles Vane faced the same grim treatment the following year. Pirates knew the terrible punishments that awaited them if they were captured alive. Even Blackbeard, the notorious Edward Teach, had to be shot 5 times and given 20 sword cuts before he finally fell in November 1718. Lieutenant Maynard, who captured him, then stuck Blackbeard's head on the prow of his ship as a warning to others. Bartholomew Roberts, another feared pirate, specifically instructed his men to dispose of his body at sea to avoid ending up in a cage. When he lost his life in action on February 1722, they followed his orders. There was no denying the harsh reality. Pirates knew exactly what awaited them if they were ever brought to justice. In some cases, the bodies were left until their clothes rotted away, or even until the bodies were nearly completely decomposed, after which the bones were scattered. For particularly gruesome displays, bodies were coated in tar or chained up. Sometimes bodies were placed in body-shaped iron cages to hold decomposing corpses. For instance, in March 1743 in Rye, East Sussex, John Breads took the life of Alan Greble. Breads was imprisoned in the Ypres Tower and then hanged. His body was left to rot for more than 20 years in an iron cage on Gibbet Marsh. The cage, with Breads' skull clamped within the headframe, is still kept in the town hall. Another example of such a cage is the gibbet iron on display at the Atwater Kent Museum in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The cage, created in 1781, was intended to display the body of convicted pirate Thomas Wilkinson. Although his planned execution never occurred, the gibbet was never used. An example of an iron cage used to suspend bodies on a gibbet can still be seen at the Westgate Museum in Winchester. Not all pirate commanders had the intent of delivering capital punishment to those who broke the ship codes. Some preferred using temporary punishment that rendered the unsubordinated pirate helpless. The use of bilbos. During the 16th and 17th centuries, these iron restraints were more than just shackles. They were the heavy hand of discipline that kept order aboard ship, enforcing the captain's rule with an unflinching grip. A long iron bar with sliding shackles. The bilbos would lock around the ankles of sailors or prisoners, forcing them into a fixed position that left them immobile and exposed. The confined sailors were not just restrained, but humiliated as well, displayed for their shipmates or in some cases for the public, adding a layer of social shame to their punishment. The idea was to make an example of them, a warning to anyone else who might think about crossing the line. But the bilbos were more than just punitive tools. They had a touch of twisted practicality. Unlike other restraints that merely bound a person, the bilbos kept the feet slightly elevated, which helped reduce swelling, a small mercy in an otherwise brutal device. As naval technology evolved and ships grew larger and more sophisticated, these iron restraints fell out of use. Yet some ruthless pirates couldn't care less, relying instead on a diabolical iron gear to carry out their most heinous acts. Terror of the Spanish tickler. In the pirates' dark hold, the Spanish tickler was known as one of the cruelest tools they used, a name that was anything but true. It wasn't a gentle tickle, it was a horrifying device designed to tear and shred. The pirates would take their time with punishments, often hanging their victims in public, sometimes using chains, sometimes a rack. The sharp claws would slice through the condemned body, cutting flesh almost to the bone. The pain was slow, agonizing, and didn't stop until there was nothing left to bleed. In modern times, it's similar to the horror character Freddy Krueger, but instead of quick, sharp cuts, pirates with the tickler took pleasure in dragging out the suffering. The whole process was so brutal that it almost always led to death. The name Spanish tickler might sound almost playful at first, but digging deeper into history reveals a much darker picture. The Spanish tickler, also known as the cat's paw, is one of the most brutal torture devices from medieval times. Made of iron, the device looked like a large claw or hand with long, sharp, curved spikes. The design was simple but very effective. Once in the hands of a torturer, the Spanish tickler would rip apart the flesh of its victims, often without even breaking the skin first. With enough force, it could tear through muscle and even reach the bone. Victims were tied down, making them helpless, and the Spanish tickler would be dragged across various parts of their body, from limbs to the torso. The agony was unimaginable as their flesh was shredded before their eyes. Blood loss, shock, and infection were common results of an encounter with this horrible device, and many didn't survive their injuries. Although it gets its name from Spain, similar devices were found all over Europe, indicating the grim reality of widespread torture during the medieval period. The psychology behind such a device wasn't just about physical pain. The sight of the Spanish tickler, with its gleaming spikes, was enough to instill terror. The anticipation of its use, the fear of what was to come, often broke prisoners' spirits even before the torture began. While the Spanish tickler wasn't commonly found aboard pirate ships, stories of such devices spread far and wide. Whispers of its use likely helped deter mutiny or kept unruly sailors in check through sheer fear of experiencing a similar fate if captured by enemies. If these captured enemies or unsubordinated pirates were lucky enough, all they would have had to deal with was a lifetime stigmatization caused by the next punishment: branding. This is a practice as ancient as human civilization itself and has often been associated with punishment, control, and identification. Unlike its common association with livestock, branding has been used across cultures as a means to mark individuals for various reasons, from punishment for criminal behavior to a sign of ownership for slaves, or even a personal choice to display group identity. The branding process involved heating a metal object until it was red hot, then pressing it onto the skin, causing severe pain and leaving a lasting scar. This act not only caused physical agony, but also carried strong psychological implications. Marking the individual for life. For pirates and seafarers, branding held a particularly cruel and humiliating significance. It served as a visual reminder of past misdeeds. A branded sailor bore the permanent mark of shame on their skin, a constant signal of their past errors. This practice acted as a deterrent to other sailors considering similar offenses, reinforcing the harsh consequences of desertion or rebellion. The branding was intended to be a visible warning to others, discouraging a life of crime at sea. In movies like Pirates of the Caribbean, branding is used to signify a character's past entanglements and misdeeds. Jack Sparrow's P brand, for instance, represents his past with the East India Company, marking him as a former pirate who had escaped a death sentence. It was not an official punishment, but rather a personal identifier meant to remind others of his past crimes and as a warning to deter further offenses. While branding was practiced in some form in English courts from the late 1600s until 1707, it was mainly used on the hand or thumb for those who avoided execution. Slave owners brand their slaves to ensure they remained under their control. For escaped slaves, branding served as a deterrent against future attempts to flee. If recaptured, they could be flogged and branded again as a warning to others. In the film, Captain Norrington finds the brand on Jack Sparrow's arm and orders him to be hanged. This action is portrayed for dramatic effect, but in reality, such a brand indicated that Sparrow's death sentence for piracy had been commuted for some reason. Without any evidence of new criminal activities, Norrington could only expel Sparrow from Port Royal, not carry out a hanging, as it would have been an unlawful act. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.